Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the first session of our Ransomware Top Threats and Best Practices Summit, brought to you by Unitrends, Ativo Networks, Zscaler, Zerto, and Delinea. Our editorial staffs have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on ransomware for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. And before we start today's three-part event, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know it's being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll soon receive an email when the replay is available. Also, each session will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our expert. And during today's third session, we will be giving away our high-end Bose noise-canceling headphones. But you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Unitrends, Ativo Networks, Zscaler, Zerto, and Delinea underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session, the top ransomware threats you're facing right now, featuring Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO at Cyjax and CTO at Octopi Managed Services, Inc. He is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT security and information technology. From 1989 to 1992, Ian served with the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch. In 2002, he joined the CF Military Police Reserves and retired as a public affairs officer in 2013. After a year with the RCMP as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst/consultant in multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare. Ian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
All right, and thank you so much for having me here, David. It's always an absolute pleasure to be able to do one of these sessions for everyone. So we'll get to the opening slide here. I'm not going to get too political on this, but just to say this is an auspicious occasion that they asked me to do something on ransomware, and although there are other ransomware operators globally, it is certainly a particularly Russian operation at the huge end of the scale. And, when asked to do and present on a topic like this, it is really difficult to look at this in kind of a coherent manner because of all of the craziness that has come out of ransomware, ranging from mainstream media, non-security pundits weighing in on this particular topic, and of course, the own information security community. And, recently we've seen some tremendous activity within this space. We'll get into it a little bit of the insider operator of a threat group that ran the Conti ransomware operation, and they have data dumped and doxed a whole bunch of information. And Brian Krebs, the cybercrime reporter of record, has been wading through it and has just recently published some of his findings on that. The environment, the ransomware environment that we're in right now is dynamic, and it is changing, and it is coming under increasing scrutiny from the government. The government has been very successful in some campaigns against ransomware operators, but others remain at large, of course, and continuing their devastating toll on especially small and medium businesses. Enterprise fall into a particularly special category that we'll talk about. So I guess the first question that we really need to ask ourselves is, are we understanding the full picture of ransomware? And unfortunately, at the government and policy level, there seems to be mixed messages. Certainly, government leaders, government officials have instructed their various intelligence and security services about the ransomware threat and to cooperate with victims and try and bring the perpetrators to justice. But these moves are instinctive when, you see a company, a large-scale company, be it, JBS Meats, when they attack our hot dogs, they attack our very way of life, ranging to other issues that we face, such as Colonial Pipelines, et cetera. So we've seen ransomware victimize our society in different ways. And I think that is something that is a very political issue that the various leaders that we have are grappling with. But unfortunately, the data that we are reporting on doesn't indicate that ransomware is as big as a problem as we think it is. There are a number of different reasons for it. One is the tendency for companies to try and keep the issues around a ransomware event under legal privilege by engaging lawyers and running the forensics operations within that legal framework, so that details are not usually publicly released, or they're couched in very vague language, but language that will get them at least a pass from regulated authority. And so, we have a major problem with painting a picture, a coherent picture, because as you can see, when you're really talking about fraud and cyber crime and cyber-enabled crime, we're seeing the top victim counts far exceeding the ransomware. Now, one of the reasons why this is so balanced is when we look at it from the perspective of victims, are we talking about a single computer with ransomware on it constituting a victim organization? But yet when you see non-payment, non-delivery, and extortion, that is usually a single person or entity that has been victimized. So we have a big problem with understanding where that data is, and I've got another slide that we can dig into it. The other thing that we have here is we don't have consistency globally when it comes to duties to report on various types of cybercrime. And then, of course, there's the shame factor of being a victim of a particular cybercrime. The next slide that breaks this down in terms of losses is really interesting. And this is 2020. These stats come from IC3, which is the collection of all of the various events from law enforcement and intelligence agencies across the United States in terms of reported cases. And we can see that ransomware, from the perspective of 2020, was at least reported to be only $29 million in damages, right? And so we have to sort of question, why is this $29 million peril, getting all of the attention, rather than, you can see what the top 4 cyber crimes, cyber-enabled crimes that are happening are right there. And, the highest on the list is business email compromise attacks to the tune of $1.8 billion. So this is interesting to me because, we keep hearing different stats thrown out there, like it'll be $8 trillion in cybercrime. And we'll get into some of this with some vendors who I love and have gone maybe a bit too far. I'll let you guys judge that when we get into it. The other problem is what exactly, how do we actually calculate the damage from a ransomware attack? And also, if it's covered under your insurance, that would drop the actual event's costs to your organization dramatically. And I'm not even talking about whether or not you paid a ransom or not. I've got some thoughts on that particular issue for sure. But I would say that, we would have never caught many of these cyber criminals if they hadn't managed to extort money from the victims that we could then trace and actually charge them in a court of law. So it's a difficult equation because, like most of these things in security, there are no 100%, and it all depends on the circumstance you're in. Now, there's no question that in terms of the Department of Justice activities in the United States, they have started to focus hard on the fraudulent activity that is accompanying cybercrime and cybercrime itself, okay? They have indicted criminals, they have extradited criminals, they have thrown criminals in jail. And in fact, even Canada got into the act recently with an actual Canadian cyber criminal facing the Canadian justice system, even though there were American victims. And he's, I believe, been sentenced to 8 years in Canadian prison. And then at the end of that, I believe we get to turn him over to the Americans for the charges that relate to American victims. So this is good. We can see international cooperation. Not too strangely, Ukraine has offered up many cyber criminals, including Russia itself offered up a number of cyber criminals. Now, I have a very sort of jaded view of that. I thought maybe those were the cyber criminals that declined the kind invitation to participate in global cyber attacks by the Russians on the event of hostilities with the Ukraine. However, don't let my sort of jadedness in terms of Russian cybercrime take you there. But this does underscore the issue that we have around reporting and clarity and understanding of what the numbers are. Because when we actually look at some of the data that we're getting from the large governments organizations here in Europe and the UK, we see an entirely different story. We see that the primary threat against your organization is ransomware. But the problem is that we're not understanding what ransomware actually is, okay? Ransomware is the symptoms of a disease. And I think that disease is poor cybersecurity that allows and facilitates the ransomware attack to happen. As an example, what was it in the case of Colonial Pipeline? It was asset management. What happened? The bad guys found a VPN that didn't have multi-factor on it, that had an old set of credentials that were publicly exposed in a data breach, or it was brute forced. I'm not exactly sure on which access it was, but that's how they got in there. And that's how Colonial Pipeline ended up suffering that data breach, which essentially attacked their billing system, and they were unable to understand, they could not conduct financial transactions at that particular point. So what are we seeing in terms of the overall trends? Well, it's certainly, it's monetization. It's all about the money, 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 right? We could break out in a Nicki Minaj song here for sure. But we also are seeing an intrinsic link between Bitcoin and cybercrime in terms of the cryptocurrency issues, which I do have a slide in here that is going to blow your mind a little bit later on. But we're seeing that the majority of these threat actors are using Bitcoin to elicit a ransom from folks. And again, we're seeing, COVID-19, and we're also seeing a really interesting trend, which was surges in attacking the healthcare sector as it related to data breaches, patient records always being very tasty in terms of exfiltration, highly regulated in most countries, thus giving the ransomware attackers more leverage to try and get a payment out of more or less the American healthcare system because it's for profit, as opposed to nationally controlled healthcare systems such as the ones in the UK and the majority of Europe. So we've seen a global rise in ransomware activity to the point where the various organizations and think tanks are identifying it as a major problem But what they're not telling you is the major problem is the cybersecurity of organizations, prior to the event, whatever you want to call it, that ends in ransomware. So, basically, ransomware comes at the end of a whole bunch of security failures at the beginning. And I think that's something that was misunderstood. But I will say the messaging that we're getting about global cybersecurity attacks, the disruption of ransomware, et cetera, especially in wake of the outbreak of the hostilities between the Ukraine and Russia and Belarus, we are seeing now, I think, this has really gotten the attention of executives. And this is not a bad thing. I think it's a bad thing when, they try to claim ignorance, but the shore up your defenses message that was pushed out by all of the organizations that are involved in, threat intelligence, NCSC over here, huge shout out to CISA, and even the Canadians warned you about it. And when the Canadians warn you about it, it's pretty for real. So I think ransomware has now made cybersecurity and the prevention of a ransomware attack a more understood and popular way of conveying that there is an online threat to an organization. Which brings me to a more depressing slide here. Now, I have to say I love both Black Frog and KnowBe4, but I think here it might be an example of maybe going a little bit too far. Certainly, and all due respect to KnowBe4, I don't think they actually launched this campaign during the recent hostilities between Ukraine and Russia, where, as we all know, Russia did something pretty provocative with their nuclear weapons. So, yeah, that's a bit in poor taste. I'll give them that. But the hype here seems to be difficult to interpret because, again, this is the consequence of that cybersecurity issue and not the reason why you ended up with ransomware in your first place, which sort of brings us to this new paradigm of detection response, the XDR, EDR, SOAR industry, et cetera, of preventing the exfiltration of data, the signals to command and control at the network layer of the organization. So this, again, though, shows the different solutions that folks are taking to the problem. One of the issues being around the awareness of users, because I see a thing like that has Mushroom Cloud, and I'd be scared. Who wouldn't be, right? And then we see the actual sort of tool sets that are coming into play of stuff to prevent, the actual process of ransomware occurring and identify some of the key activities that lead to ransomware. And I found these guys who really kind of hit the nail on the head. And it's sort of like, it's not the encryption of the files that kill you, in brackets, unless you don't have backups, right? But it's the actual money that you pay one way or the other, right? So an organization gets hit by ransomware and it tears through their organization, and they're hit with the question of, okay, do we pay to get our files restored, or do we just burn everything to the ground and restore from backup? Which one here is part of that equation? But then it gets complicated because at the very time you're trying to make that decision, you have the ransomware operator saying, hey, buddy, we have all your data, and we're going to do terrible things with that data unless you pay, right? Because what we saw is the evolution of cybercrime, and it's something we're going to talk about in a moment. And what it is it's a whole bunch of different ways that you can extort organizations. Now, in the post-breach, and I've heard from organizations that didn't pay the ransom, but yet their data was made available on the dark web, what happens then is their own data is used against them for those business email compromise attacks, for fake invoice scams, changes to payroll by providing all of the payroll information to employees. Please change my my payroll information, here's my employee number, here's my date of birth, here's all the information. So there then became, that extortion is based on all of that data that was put into the criminal hands to monetize the stolen data because the ransomware wasn't paid. So there are extreme calculations of risk and damage and impact that have to be conducted in post-ransomware. And I think this is why, in a lot of cases, you need legal privileged operators and incident responders so that you can do the appropriate thing in order to try and lessen the risk to your organization as much as possible and minimize the actual damage that your firm is going to face if the ransomware attack was successful. Now, a quick overview of how we get to where we are. And I think it's really important to take a look at these two cases. So obviously we had a huge criminal activity gang back in 1999. What they were doing was they were breaking into companies' private branch exchanges, right? So this was way back, this was way before we had IP telephone systems. This was the original sort of landline PBXs. I've got a call holding for you on line one, all of that good stuff. They would break into these PBXs. They would create a voicemail that says something like, I accept the charges, instead of, I'm the CFO of the organization. And then they would sell those numbers that would authorize long-distance charges out on the street to the immigrant community, to anyone that needed to phone home. Okay? So this is a criminal gang. Obviously, along comes things like Skype. And the cost of long distance plummeted as a result of mass investment in infrastructure. That was no longer a viable criminal enterprise, right? You're not going to sell access to a PBX number that will authorize long distance charges anymore when a person can download and use Skype more or less for free, right? Or Zoom or any of the other 10 different collaboration apps I have open on my MacBook that makes it hiss like it's a snake. Here we get to an interesting game, though, that was played that started to, look at and target the desktop computer system, and that was the fake antivirus warnings that would come up on your PC, right? That would even potentially connect you to a help desk, the "you have a virus" type of thing. This morphed in around 2015 into actual pretend lockers, is what we called them, before we got into the encryption of your files. And then when encryption of your files became a real thing, people combated that primarily with backup. And again, the cyber criminals modified their behavior and went, we're going to destroy your backups before we encrypt your files. And then finally, that tactic morphed into, we're going to take all of your files, make a backup copy of them for us, encrypt your files, and then try to extort a ransom for you. So the point of all of this is that every time we make a move to try and combat the cyber criminal TTPs or MITRE attack framework that they happen to be using, they will again modify themselves again. And they will create great difficulty in law enforcement organization because they'll diversify the supply chain in terms of criminality. What do I mean by that? I mean that I can buy ransomware as a package on the dark web. I can become a cyber criminal tomorrow, right? But how do I get to my victims? Well, now I can get a service that will blast out all of the links that I need to start, encrypting people's PCs. And I can even buy access from data breaches that will allow me to get into companies because they're called access brokers in the dark web. Folks that have previously data breached or have data breached a company, but all that they've done is stolen the credentials and then offered them up for sale. So we see how this Hydra, every time we cut one cyber criminal head off, 2 or 3 grow in their place. So this is sort of an interesting thing that kind of during the pandemic changed a lot. Our traditional view of the APT actors and cyber criminals was it was like phishing attacks. It was email, right, with documents in them or web links. And interesting enough, I'm not saying this doesn't go on anymore, but when you look at some of the biggest attacks that happened during the pandemic and continue to happen today, it actually has changed the game. And I'm gonna talk about that once we sort of go through some of the more interesting pieces that I have here for you guys. I think the other problem is that we can't equate APT and cyber criminals to the same thing, although they use some of the same capabilities, because one is either purely financially motivated or espionage related. Although we have seen some APT organizations that go either way. And a lot of this happens when we put a currency sanctions on a regime like Iran or North Korea, potentially Russia, and they actually turn to ransomware and they turn to crypto, specifically targeting crypto or targeting infrastructure to do crypto mining in order to get Bitcoin currency to prop up the regime's capital reserves, right? We live in a world now where a ransomware infection in a Ukrainian business that is doing business for a North American or European business could spread through MPLS and VPN connections. So this is, again, a thing that, because we're a very interconnected world, because organizations have different ways of exchanging data and sharing data, there's a danger that there are connections can be hijacked and used to spread ransomware from one company X to one company Y. The nice thing, though, is most ransomware attacks are easily detected because, on your screen is like this thing that's saying you're encrypted, right? So it's a fairly easy to detect attack. But this is still a huge necessity for a minimal level of training, especially around incident response, like calling someone, telling someone, disconnecting your computer from its connection and getting in touch with your support team as soon as you can. Because if you're lucky, they'll be able to start isolating machines or force updates to their systems to try and protect them. Because it's not like it doesn't take some amount of time, especially in large enterprise networks, for the ransomware contagion to spread once it's landed. And I think the big thing that I'm going to talk about a little bit is really the importance of threat modeling and understanding the adversary that you may face that may launch a ransomware attack on you, right? So this is the interesting thing. I mentioned it earlier about Bitcoin and the relationship to ransomware payments. Like we can see here, about 98% of those ransomware payments in 2019 were in Bitcoin. But this is the thing that was really interesting to me is when I started looking into this, especially in wake of the Mueller indictments in 2016, where they had essentially traced the creation of the Bitcoin, who used it, to buy what infrastructure, to prop up the various attacks that the DCCC and the Democratic Party, the Hillary Clinton email server issues, that they had gone back and they developed technology to trace the IP addresses as IDs of folks sending and receiving Bitcoin in documents dating back to 2013. So the technology to track these individuals in terms of their Bitcoin consumption from illicit activity does exist. And we've seen numerous situations where organizations have benefited from that, including offensive cyber actions by the intelligence services in the United States and the FBI to, for instance, obtain the Kaseya ransomware decrypting key from a compromised ransomware operator's server. And this is what becomes very interesting for the Conti gang of ransomware operators in the fact that they've been doxxed by an insider threat essentially. It's hilarious that the threat group has their own insider threat to me, and all sorts of interesting things are going to come out of that. I've heard that one cybercrime journalist was looking to get in on the action by basically saying to the ransomware gang, hey, listen, I'll write stories about your victims for 5% of the take. So a lot of unethical behavior, and also there is some very clear connections between that ransomware gang and the Russian government. So there you go. So I talked a lot about threat models and threat intelligence. I work for a threat intelligence company, but I just wanted to pull this out because it's very timely. This is the major actors that are using cyber attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. What's very interesting about this is it was targeting one particular CMS. As you can see, it's scoring a 9.1. That's a pretty serious vulnerability. But you can see, essentially, they were looking for this content management system and trying to exploit it. And so this is what I mean. If you don't have that content management system and you're not located in the Ukraine, this is something that's interesting to be aware of, but it's not, a call for alarm. By any stretch of the imagination, unless you happen to have that software, in which case you better patch it, update it, or put it behind some mitigating controls. Otherwise, you're going to get owned. But this is an important thing, and I think more importantly that we found out from the Log4j experiences that we all went through at one layer or another. You were either a Microsoft.NET shop and Log4j wasn't something you really needed to worry about, or you were an open source firm running the Apache stack, in which case you're asking the question is, how can something that's supposed to be processing logs actually execute strings? Big sort of question there. But again, you need to understand what is in your infrastructure. And this actually comes down that one of the key areas that we need to focus on when we talk about preventing the series of unfortunate events that occur to give you ransomware is really around asset management and SBOM, or what the cool kids are calling software bill of materials. Again, a lot of great resources coming out with CISA. I love this. They're updating a list of commonly exploited vulnerabilities kind of in real time. So whatever the evil ransomware users or APT nation states are using to exploit your systems, that then install a Trojan, that then drop a payload that could be ransomware, it could be espionage, or conduct lateral movement using different tools, all of that kind of stuff starts with the exploit. And being aware of the type of exploits that are out there, whether or not your infrastructure is vulnerable to that, is the key in defending yourself against the first of those very unfortunate events. Second thing, really, really important, is using the Verizon data breach report data, you can construct a threat risk assessment based on your particular industry vertical and what and how the organization is getting penetrated by the malicious actors. This stat, I think, is one of the most interesting ones. Phishing or social engineering attacks, the most popular one, followed by the use of stolen credentials, other is in there, and then actual malware attacks is in fourth place after other, which, to be fair, Verizon data breach, we'd probably benefit from a really strong definition of what other exactly means. But you can see that if your security program gets obsessed with preventing ransomware, the two most likely avenues of attack based on the global data in the Verizon data breach report would suggest you're putting your money in the wrong place, right? Okay. And we can see this is really apparent when we look at the data accumulated, including all the different sort of ways the attackers are getting access to organizations that fit into that particular vertical, and what the actual recommended controls are. And you'll find security awareness training on top of all of them, to construct that threat model against your particular industry vertical. Now, I'm not saying that is the only thing you should need to take into consideration, but this will give you a good baseline in developing a threat risk model that you can then apply intelligence to maybe, I'm just saying this, anticipate the types of attacks on your organizations that may end up leaving you with ransomware. Let's look at some of these vectors of attack right now and talk a little bit about what we're seeing. And I highlighted exploit-exposed services and neglected systems because lately some of the most horrific ransomware attacks involved VPN concentrators, right, as well as infrastructure that you thought had been decommissioned but was actually running and actually presented a vulnerable attack surface to the internet. So this is why going to a tool like DNS Dumpster, putting in your domain and looking at all the pretty IP addresses that hang off of that is probably one of the best ways for you to start thinking about and managing your attack surface. Email attachments. I would say now, from the data I've seen, no longer the most common delivery method. Why? Because Microsoft and Google are really figuring this out and applying machine learning and AI to pull a lot of the nasty attachments off. However, I will say this. In recent weeks, I've received a spreadsheet, sometimes labeled, money transfer or reconciliation, I think I saw it as, and it sailed right through, and it had a VB, yes, a Visual Basic. Folks, we're back to Visual Basic as an attack surface, like 2010 called, and they want their, Office 2008 back. But we're seeing that, which I thought was remarkable that managed to get through all of the AI machine learning capabilities of Microsoft and Office 365 protections. Interesting, though, that might be because maybe they sunset or maybe it hadn't been seen in such a long time that the AI basically was looking for, all of your Cobalt Strike related type of payloads instead of something old school like a VB dropper, right? And again, user awareness training. Even when somebody sends a Dropbox link to me or something like that, and I'm not really expecting it, I'm like, no, just no. Again, you see this. What was interesting here is I saw a lot of staging of payloads into things like Discord, for instance, because traditional file sharing companies now have been scanning and looking for malware within the files that are uploaded and downloaded. And I noticed that even on my Mac using OneDrive, OneDrive will find nasty files now on the Mac platform that it never found on that conversely that were only found on the PC platform because OneDrive needed Windows Defender, and that OneDrive wasn't actually doing that in the cloud scanning piece, which I think they now might be. And again, this is all about user awareness, and this is why that cyber-enabled crime, where they use exfil data from an organization to trick you into, doing something that you wouldn't otherwise do, and they deliver it to you from an innocuous-seeming web link from maybe even a file sharing or a thing that you've used before to get you to get and do something that you wouldn't otherwise do. So again, compromised websites or infrastructure that's stood up by the bad guys, we see this a lot. Interesting thing about these campaigns, they rarely last for more than 24 hours to 36 hours now. So the whole set up, blast out emails, push them out on social media, Slack, Discord, wherever the bad guys decide, Telegram or WhatsApp, to get people to click on it. The whole campaign, and that most of these campaigns are focused to steal Office 365 credentials. You've got those documents all the time. Occasionally, I get a, your password is about to expire. Click here to reset your password or to keep using your password. Need to verify your password. It's all about credential attacks, and these campaigns go really quickly. And many thanks to all the security researchers out there and operations staff at the hosting providers that tear down infrastructure as soon as they're alerted to malicious behavior. You folks are doing God's work, no question about it. So this one was really interesting. This is sort of all about exposed services. Now, in some cases, we see APT operators going after these exposed services with exploits. Okay, we saw this with, Exchange was a great example of how your Exchange services that were on the outside of your organization, Outlook Web Access for all of you old school people, were getting owned. The SMTP daemon was getting owned. There were a whole bunch of attacks launched at Exchange infrastructure. Or VPN endpoints like Pulsar VPN and SonicWall or Fortinet for a while. So, everyone sort of got victimized by this. These are really easy to detect attacks. They're pretty easy to mitigate as well. Most of the tools are there. Don't expose these services to the entirety of the internet. Be very selective about what can even access them. Please protect them by multi-factor authentication. And, this is all about knowing your attack surface, knowing about what you have exposed. Don't put a 2008 remote desktop protocol server on the internet without compensating controls. Dear God, don't do that. Or disabling security to make it work. Not also cool. So 0 days, we can talk about them. Log4j was probably the nearest one that we had that became a 0-day very quickly. The vendor was unaware of it. Apache was unaware of it. It was first used, I think, in the Minecraft environment, and Minecraft servers were getting pwned. And yeah, it can go global. It can be devastating. I think in a lot of these cases, this is really about your own attack surface management and understanding, like I said, the SBOM or software bill of materials and external asset management to find out if you're vulnerable. And interestingly enough, the botnet that was based on WatchGuard that was attributed to Russian actors, there's an example again of a 0-day being exploited on your actual security appliance, facing the internet. Now, fortunately, I don't think many folks were impacted in a particularly evil way by that particular botnet that was set up, because that botnet was being used to conduct denial of service attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. So again, what they were doing is recruiting these boxes to denial of service attack the Ukrainians as part of their Russian mission. And yeah, neglected systems. I mean, there's no other sort of way of suggesting this, other than looking at that again, the Colonial Pipeline attack that I talked about earlier. This comes down to having your decommissioning, making sure you're doing decommissioning, making sure that you're if you want to keep that domain, you're sinkholing it on this domain is a reserved space. These type of things. So, really this is about cleaning up after the mess. I've been in numerous situations where the folks have said, oh, we've migrated everything to the cloud. Hey, that's great. Well, why are these on-premise servers running? Oh, well, they're just there in case we need them. I'm like, well, but all of your data's in the cloud and you bought all these cloud tools. So what you're telling me is there's another copy of your data sitting right here. So again, it's sort of about, making sure that you're closing things off, closing things down, and protecting those development environments as well, because in a lot of cases, the contagion can get into a development environment and then be pushed into production. And there's no other great example of that than the SolarWinds situation and supply chain attack there. So, this is an interesting sort of stat that I thought I'd just sort of talk about briefly, is that, what we're seeing is that the Grand Crab ransomware family was the most prevalent at 78.5%. It's interesting because Black Frog has some different stats on what they're seeing in terms of malware families and stuff like that. But I'd say that VirusTotal basically is probably, the biggest repository, other than perhaps Microsoft's endpoint Defender, which they have on every box out there in terms of telemetry. But I found that interesting that, that the majority of these samples that we're dealing with come from Grand Crab, which, has been around for almost six years or longer. So I put this kind of thing, So I was seeing this a lot online about, the cloud, and, I wanted to sort of now talk a little bit about the cloud attack surface so that you can understand some of the differences between the TTPs that we see against a on-premise network infrastructure versus the crews that are going after your stuff in the cloud. And what we can see is, okay, vulnerability management in terms of rogue, there we go, remote code-facing vulnerabilities, patch and update your stuff, right? End of stuff. The fact that they're still exploiting Adobe Cold Fusion really makes me kind of wonder what the hell is going on. Adobe Cold Fusion, I think, was life-cycled about 3 years ago. I know it's probably still out there, but goodness, like that's going way back. But here's an interesting, thing about Fancy Bear, right? A lot of people call the Russian APT group here like the legit Fancy Bear back in the day. They talk about them being, so sophisticated and stuff like that. But what we're seeing is brute force attacks against Kubernetes clusters, right? By, this high-end super hacking group. So again, simple works. They wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't simple to deal with. And then Team TNT, German-speaking cyber criminals. Cyber criminal gang specifically targeting, misconfigured and publicly exposed stuff to the internet. Go to Grey Hat Warfare and run your company's name and see what kind of data is exposed in public S1 bucket or S2 buckets and S3 buckets and Microsoft blobs. And then finally, crypto, the 8220 mining group, Chinese-speaking illegal currency mining operation. These people get into cloud-facing stuff. They drop their cloud mining capabilities. If they manage to get your administrative console credentials because you didn't protect it with multi-factor authentication, at the end of the month, you get a giant bill because they have managed to push up all sorts of the biggest, most expensive EC3 rigs in order to mine crypto at your dime, on your credit card or on your account. So this is one of the things where having some limits, as illustrated by the lovely Troy Hunt in his most recent blog, I think, or a blog that is a couple of weeks back, where he got pwned because of a Cloudflare misconfiguration. The only way he found out about it was getting a giant bill because he hadn't set up account limits on his Azure. So, true to life story. But I also wanted to bring up how I've been pwned because it is by far and away the best way to start your journey to understanding your threat landscape and protecting your credentials, because the game has changed, my friends, significantly. It's now about, especially in the cloud, multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, IDAM. That's where the game is in terms of cybersecurity and preventing access to your infrastructure, access to your Office 365 email, and access to your SaaS environments as well. Shared account passwords, very bad idea. They never stay secret. Again, and reused passwords. That's a terrible idea, completely terrible idea. And this is where it now becomes, like, if you look at those as mitigating factors, this is where you really want to go with IR, so incident response, DR, and BCP. Make sure you have those resources and training exercises to not just deal with ransomware that, for the dozen times I've said it, which is at the end of a very bad failure of security, but make sure you guys are up for it. Social media awareness is huge too, in that, if you are in the middle of an incident, please brief those public relations people so that you don't have to endure the terrible response I got from my former accountancy company, because they clueless, they didn't know what was going on, they weren't being honest, and it took them weeks to try and restore their systems. It was a complete disaster for them, and they shall feel my wrath because I was in a news article talking about them. Process, procedures, training, and I added accountability because accountability is all about making sure that you're ticketing things, you're putting details into tickets so you can manage your response so that you have a clear understanding of what's going on and one place for the information instead of running around in all sorts of silos. Big believer in a CTI program or a TIP program, threat intelligence program, or cyber threat intelligence to direct the best investments in terms of what your attack surface looks like, in terms of what you have at risk within your organization, and what kind of adversary you may line up against. And finally, security controls. We all talk about them. I want to send a huge shout out to the sponsors that allow me to get up here and get in front of this podium and talk about the things as I see them. And with that, I think we got a duplicate slide there, but I do believe it is the best free thing anyone can do. And with that, we are at the Q&A section. Line them up, David.
Okay. Thank you for that great presentation. And we do have some audience questions. We got a few minutes to get through them, so let's just get started right away. First come, first serve. First question comes from Steve. Should we provide a national security protection against ransomware/hacking? Is it possible? And what are the obstacles, pros/cons?
Well, I mean, we do have laws that say we shouldn't do it, I think that we're going to come to the conclusion that, it's not, in order to cure, the disease, we need to deal with the monetary side of this. I think that, we need to find a way to target this, seize assets, and really kind of try to take the affluence out of this particular crime for organizations. And I think we need to incentivize it. I've stated publicly on a number of occasions that I think that security investment as a percentage of annual turnover or revenue, as you folks like to call it, should be tax deductible. In that if you make a security investment, you can take that money, apply it against your corporate taxes, and reduce the amount of corporate tax payable. I think we're at the point where nationally they need a program to incentivize security that goes something a little bit better than, getting breached is bad. Because that's kind of where we are at right now, because anything impactful takes weeks and weeks and months, if not years, to make its way through the courts, either class action or regulatory action. So I think we need to, cut the financial head off and then incentivize spend on cybersecurity up to, as a maximum based on your annual turnover.
Okay, moving right along. Next question comes from Richard. Is it true that an organization that pays a ransom may be indicted for supporting terrorism?
All right, so I am not aware of any indictments currently that have indicated that the charges include aiding and abetting terrorism. However, I have seen one person, it was a number of years ago, indicted for aiding and abetting terrorism by spreading social media information and working as a direct agent in the cyber for ISIS. So the fact that you pay a ransom and the organization is unaware that those folks might be an Iranian company that's under sanctions or a North Korean actor, it would then come down to, can I, as the government, prove that you sent that money not knowing that those actors were on a sanction list or in support of terrorism organizations? Do I believe it's happened? Yes, probably. But, it's difficult to prove that that person willingly contravened that law. So I think that's one of the things. But this is a problem, a for real problem, especially for organizations that have to publicly disclose data breach information like the SEC, that are regulated by the SEC. So it is a peril, it is a risk, 100%. But this is also why you may use a legal framework to protect the disclosure of actually paying that ransom and who you paid it to.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Ian, for a great presentation and answering those questions.
My pleasure. These are always fun and amazing, and thank you to the audience as well.
Thanks. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course, our sponsors for today, Unitrends, Ativo Networks, Zscaler, Zerto, and Delinea, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director, and I'm here to moderate the second session of our Ransomware Top Threats and Best Practices Summit. This second session is called Best Practices for Protecting Against and Recovering from Ransomware. Our speakers for this session are Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, and John O'Neill Sr., Chief Technologist, AWS Solutions. Dave is a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communications networks within multi-server environments, and he has led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. John is the Chief Technologist for AWS Solutions. During his more than 20 years in IT, John has worked as a consultant, architect, executive, speaker, and author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects, and has authored material for Thomson Reuters Aspator books, sorry about that, and Exec Blueprints. And he develops courseware for Pluralsight as well. Take it away, Dave and John.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the warm introduction, Gladys. We're so happy to be here today. And you know what, John? I don't think that this particular session could have come at a better time for those individuals that are listening right now. The state of affairs that's in the world right now over the last couple of weeks has made this a top priority for so many organizations, because I think it's fair to say that there's not cyber threats anymore, that we're actively at cyber war. Would that be a fair statement, John?
It absolutely would, Dave, and I'm looking forward to get into that a little bit more, because that has some very specific meanings when it comes to cyber insurance and insurance policies and in general, and legalities and some things like that. So I can't wait to discuss that with everyone, and I want to say a quick thank you to Gladys for the great intro. This is our first time working a webinar together, and I'm really enjoying it so far.
Awesome. So for executives, they can just turn on their TVs now. And, I think the days of an organization, and I hate to kind of use this pun, but to bury your head in the sand and pretend that security threats don't exist, I think those days are long gone for executives, E-teams, boards right now, and senior advisors to companies. Because if you don't have a rational plan of what you're going to do, you're going to be in some very serious, you're going to have some very serious issues, John, especially when it comes to renewing cyber insurance and things like that. Because I heard a rumor that even in this past week that there's new riders on cyber insurance right now for attacks that are based on acts of war and things like that. Is that true?
Yes, actually, it is. With one little clarification, it's actually not new. It's been there forever, but nobody really has paid much attention to it, because it's been quite a while since we've worried about acts of war impacting us. And so I hope you don't mind. I want to take a couple minutes on this, because it's very important to what's going on right now for all of our fellow IT pros and their organizations. So insurance policies for as long as you can remember have had a exclusionary context that says, hey, under acts of God, things like that, force majeure, some people know it as, or acts of war, the insurance policy doesn't cover it. So if you're in a war zone and a bomb hits your house, your insurance company isn't going to replace your house. And that's been there for, like I said, as long as you can remember. It's also been there under your cyber insurance policies. Nobody really paid attention to it because we're talking about malware and ransomware and that kind of thing. Problem that we have over the last couple of weeks is that, well publicized, Russia, and possibly with support of some of their allies, released a cyber warfare attack on the Ukraine, and some of that malware or bits of that malware, pieces of its code, have showed up in attacks all over the world, countries that aren't even embroiled in this on the ground, that sort of thing. And here's how that plays out. And I just had a discussion with representatives from the largest insurance carrier globally yesterday about this topic. So they define warfare in a couple different ways. Of course, there's if war is declared, and this is a U.S.-based reference, but if war is declared by the president or a Congress, that's one way. But they often also clarify it as being declared a war situation if the president or Congress or other governmental officials implement punitive actions against a foreign country or that sort of thing, which of course we have. The global, pretty much the global space has. Many countries have issued sanctions and other punitive actions, which means that a lot of this malware that we're seeing can be classified as occurring in a warfare environment. Thus, they're not going to pay out on any claims. So if the malware that affects you 6 months from now has a piece of reused code that attributes to this, you could have a real hard time getting them to pay. And you need to remember, you may be able to get them to pay downstream, but how long can you survive without reimbursement from your insurance company? Because it could take years. How much can you invest in lawyers to go up against your insurance company's lawyers, those kind of things. So this is a huge deal, and it really does change the game. And, when you want to talk about real-world impacts, we have in that slide about supply chains, it was well publicized this week that a downstream supplier, so a component supplier for Toyota in Japan, was affected by malware that at this point looks like it came out of the Russian-based malware that attacked Ukraine, and it shut that downstream supplier down. Well, they weren't able to supply the parts to Toyota, and Toyota ended up needing to shut down 14 of their production facilities for lack of parts to build cars. Now, I want you to think about, if you're that downstream supplier, what's that impact to you? Not just getting back up and running, but do you think Toyota is going to consider you for future business? Do you think they're going to want money back from you for their lost production time? All those kind of things. So when we talk about malware destroying things, Dave, I can't think of a better example, right? I would consider that company to have a real hard road to hoe here to regain just their ability to exist.
Well, and that's something that's not always talked about, John, which is the fact that when you take and you have some type of attack, the damage to the reputation of that organization. Like, how much do you think Toyota's enjoying it right now with their name being dragged through the mud as an organization that had to go down because of this? Probably not a lot. So it's a little bit of food for thought for our viewers here today that, what you had in place before, and I think this is so important. This is like one of the gold nuggets of our session, is that you need to be constantly reevaluating your cyber ops and your cybersecurity plans, because the landscape changes so fast. It's not static at all. All right. So ransomware. So yesterday, John, the attack where, we saw organized crime like that Rebel syndicate that was based out of Russia, they took in hundreds of millions of dollars, and it was a form of organized crime the Kaseya takedown where, they got system level access and delivered probably the single biggest ransomware payload in history. That was huge for them. But what was the reason that I say ransomware so yesterday? With what's happened in the world in the last 2 weeks, you have to now think that maybe this piece of malware has one single purpose in life, John. Maybe that one single purpose in life is to cause as much destruction and as much chaos as possible. So this is like ransomware without a recovery key. This is like a certificate-based encryption algorithm where somebody swallows the key or throws it away or buries it, and you're never getting it back. So one of the things that I advise organizations on right now, immediately, is you need to have some type of a dark and immutable copy of your data, because in the event that you get a malware strain that's just out there to do nothing but destroy anything it touches, you are going to be just fine with having a backup that's a week old or anything that you can recover to, because it is going to go attach itself and try to just destroy whatever it can get its hands on.
Heck yeah, Dave. And in addition to that, you and I have talked about this before, people have to be ready to not just recover, but recover in a protected way. So you better have a plan that, hey, okay, I can recover from my immutable backup, but I have to keep my internet connectivity offline, because that attack can still be out there and still be going. And I liken it to, when you're playing a video game and you die and you get a new life and you come back up and the guy's still shooting and you just die again and you keep dying again and dying again. We can restore those backups all we want, but if the onslaught hasn't stopped and we haven't done anything to kind of put up a wall between us, it's just going to be an over and over and over thing. And the important distinction for folks to meet, and this is well publicized, it's been publicized not only by the media, but also in alerts from different governmental entities and security agencies, that the current set of malware, the malware that took down that organization we just talked about during the previous slide, is designed solely for destruction and disruption. They don't want anything out of you other than for you to be offline, to you to not be able to conduct business, to do your normal things. That is the distinction between a piece of malware that is designed to get money or create a market advantage or something else, versus cyber warfare malware, which is just designed to create the most massive destruction, terror, all those things that you want. And unfortunately, everybody from the smallest donut shop on the corner to the largest global economy corporations are affected by this. They're in the crosshairs.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And the other thing is that I want organizations to really pay attention to the briefings that are coming out from the FBI and also coming out from the Canadian government. It's the first time I've actually ever seen just a blanket coming from the Canadian government as just an all-out advisory warning of imminent cyber attacks coming based on sanctions that are taken and being put in place. So it's not something, we're not trying to pump up our session. We're not trying to scare anyone here, John, but you need to take this stuff very, very seriously, because we're hoping that some of the information that you've gleaned from our session today can help you go back to your organizations and put some plans in place to protect yourselves. All right, so a couple new ones that have come out as well, because we've been doing these sessions now going on for, I don't know, John, probably about the last 1 to 2 years now, probably since almost the beginning of when, COVID hit. And there's some new fine print that's coming out that we've seen in the past couple months with the new cyber policies in 2022. And that's your critical vulnerabilities and exploits, or CVEs, and what that impact is to your cyber insurance. And so I understand, and you can probably allude to this a little bit more, that there's a timing window in here where, for example, if you've got CVEs that are greater than 1 year old, that you actually might not be covered inside of your policy. And if you have CVEs that are greater than 90 days, it's just an increase on your deductible. And I've seen up to the tune of like 30 to 50% on your deductible. And just to throw a number out for our audience here, let's say you have a $10 million policy, a 50% deductible for you is $5 million. So it's significant. And so now you're tasked with making sure that you have no CVEs. And I want to let everybody know, John, that it is possible to get those CVEs down, but you need to make sure that you have a concerted effort with your IT team, cyber ops. This is a whole team initiative to try to get those CVEs down, because sometimes they come out faster than we can fix them. So what are your thoughts on the CVEs and the changes in cyber?
Well, thanks, Dave. And for those that don't know, as Dave mentioned, we spend a lot of time talking with insurance, not just insurance brokers and representatives, but the actual underwriting teams for the large insurance companies that are paying the claims at the end of the day. And there's a couple things that everybody should remember, that insurance companies are for-profit organizations. These aren't non-profit charitable organizations. They're designed to make a profit. So keep that in mind when you're wondering about, why do these guys keep talking like the insurance companies make it hard to get a claim paid? Well, if any of you have ever had a car accident and needed a car repair, while the process can be smooth, you notice that they're not really running there to give you a check to, just buy a brand new vehicle. They're going to get it replaced, and sometimes they're going to use used parts, and they're going to do all these different things to lower the cost on them. No different with cyber insurance. And one of the things that the carriers have started doing that we've seen in late 2021 and into 2022 is exactly what you mentioned, Dave, and that's that they're saying if you have things like unsupported equipment or software, meaning not supported by its manufacturer. So anybody that thinks I'm going to go out and get one of those third-party support providers for my auto warranty, servers, that doesn't make you compliant. You're still non-compliant because the manufacturer, the person who is in a place to issue security fixes and that kind of thing, has said it's end of life, it's end of support. Or things like CVEs that we're talking about here, common vulnerabilities and exploits. And what's going to happen here is they're adding language to try and motivate you right now, where they're saying, hey, if you have a machine that has an open CVE, even one, we're going to reduce your coverage by 25%. And then we're going to go up on a scale. That 25% is good if the CVE was released today, and it'll last for, say, 30 days. For 45 days. And then at that point, from 45 to 90 days, it's going to increase to 50%. And then from 90 days to 180 days or something like that, it's going to go up from there. And the up part is the amount you have to pay that they're not going to pay, just like you mentioned, Dave. And the expectation is that by next year, some renewals that are occurring the end of 2022 or into the beginning of 2023, the large insurance carriers are going to make those reductions or retention amounts even higher than ever before, even higher than what we're talking about right now. And there's a thing that I want everybody to also think about, is that if the insurance company can show that the impacted device had any role in the malware, even if the result of the problem is that your servers were all ransomed, right? And the machine with a CVE is this Windows desktop out on the marketing department's desk. Well, they're going to exclude the entire claim or reduce the entire claim because it had a role in it, okay? The other thing I want everybody to keep in mind is that if you say that you have zero impacted CVEs and they come in and they can show that that wasn't true, not only are you questionable on the, making a false statement to gain an insurance coverage, and that's insurance fraud, but you're certainly not going to be paid out. And at the end of the day, the whole purpose of cyber insurance and all the things that we're talking about, the tips we're putting forward here, is protecting your organization so that you and your fellow coworkers and your peers and everybody, can get back to life at normal and still have a job and still have an organization and that kind of thing. And what we're looking at in the environment now is there's companies that just won't come back from certain impacts. I liken it to when 9/11 happened, and a lot of companies that were in that destruction zone, they had their backups a block or two away, so they were also destroyed. and those companies never recovered because they weren't able to get online in time and their losses were too great. We're going to see some of that with the current generation of malware that's out there.
Yeah, for sure. John, we've got a comment coming in from Andy, and it's actually a really good one. So Andy is saying that, that's like what we're talking about is really the truth, that we're being attacked on both fronts here, not just from the threat actors, but from technically the insurance companies as well on their bottom lines, because they want to take and like you said, they're a for-profit business, right? And so, yeah, that's a really good point, Andy. We really appreciate that. Okay, so the next thing is what can we start doing? So what are some of the tricks that you can start implementing immediately to help your organization? Number one, vulnerability assessments. Vulnerability assessments are something that most of us are quite well aware of. Vulnerability assessments will scan the systems against a certain type of baseline and tell you, how good you're sitting, what holes you might have. And it's no different than kind of an IT security audit that you would have. And in traditional speak, we would typically, find some funding, and we would do this on a yearly basis. And, we would take those reports and we'd spend the next year fixing them. Well, unfortunately, that's not good enough anymore. Now you need real-time vulnerability assessments. Get yourself some tools that can take and help with this. John and I are very well versed in the Microsoft space. So from a Microsoft perspective, this comes as part of their advanced threat protection suite of products. And you have to pay attention to them. Don't just let your vulnerability assessment scans. You have to actually go through the tool sets and work through all of the recommended remediations. And not all vulnerabilities are things that you can plug up right away, because you might break some critical infrastructure. So you have to decide whether or not your organization is going to be willing to take that risk. And so my advice is you plug all the holes that you can quickly, the kind of low-hanging fruit. Then you take the list of the rest of them back to the business, assess the risk, and say, listen, if we don't close this, this is potentially the risk. And if we do close this, the risk is we could take down some internal infrastructure. And in most cases now, the businesses that we're working with, John, are like, we're going to err on the side of caution, and we're going to try to take the higher security posture, and we'll lose a little bit of functionality, because if that change happens to be one of the safeguards that we've got in place that can stop one of those cyber attacks, that could be the difference maker, right? And so that's a big one that I'm seeing right now. And that's really important, that, you look at those real-time vulnerability assessments and get your team trained up so that they're dealing on those right away. And it's now actually becoming part of a requirement for, as John mentioned, a lot of those cyber insurance policies. Now, our next one that we have here, John, zero trust. And so anybody that's gone on to one of the big players' websites, if you go look at anything Azure, AWS, or any of the big boys in the cloud space that are out there, zero trust is something that you've probably read about. But you need to really take this to the next level. You need to implement zero trust today. And this is one that I'll lean on you here a little bit, John, is the fact that implementing zero trust can seem daunting to a lot of organizations, but it is possible to get this in. It can be very frustrating for our IT staff that maybe isn't used to a zero trust model where we're moving into highly secured environments. But you know what it is? It's something that you just have to deal with and get used to, because you've got to break those bad habits of taking super admin accounts and logging into everything. So what's your advice, John, for organizations that have yet to implement a zero trust model, and how they can kind of expedite that?
Dave, one of the big reasons that I see in my discussion with organizations and their IT pros and their businesses, their C-suites, is that, they've talked about this, but they really don't feel that they have the resources available to implement a project of this scale. And I tell them that's because they're trying to eat an elephant in one bite, okay? And you just don't do that, but there's no reason to start eating your sandwich, okay? So I'll take away from the elephant analogy and I'll go to a sandwich. Eat a sandwich a bite at a time. And what this means is yes, you may not be able to devote the resources to even doing a fact finding of, everything that needs to change to properly implement zero trust and assume breach methodologies. But you can certainly look at little pieces and start making improvements. Okay? When you're assigning file or folder permissions for someone, take a look at what's already there. Take an extra 60 seconds and determine, does anything jump out as not being necessary? Okay? Maybe look at your security groups for some of your most highly sensitive areas, such as human resources or payroll, financial, that kind of thing. Maybe you have some great intellectual property, and so you want to check your engineering folders, those kind of things. But take it a bite at a time and start implementing it and do exactly what you mentioned, Dave. Take a look at those high-level admin groups, because, the fact of the matter is in even the largest organization, the number of members of these groups should still be very small. Single digits, maybe double digits in a couple areas, but enterprise admins, even in the largest organization, shouldn't have dozens of people in it. Schema admins shouldn't have dozens of people in it, because I could take the largest organization, and if I broke it down and said, okay, out of the IT group, who actually works with Active Directory or the identity management system, and that's going to be some smaller subset. And then I could say, out of the people that work with that, how many of them actually need to extend or modify the schema, and that's going to get real loose. And you can see it's not going to take me hours or days to go through that exercise. So, eat your sandwich a bite at a time, but start doing it today. When you get off this webinar, start doing it. Don't delay any longer, because every day you delay leaves a vulnerability open. And on those CVEs, everybody, just like Dave mentioned, you have to be monitoring those every day, because they change every day. So you got to find a way to get some time allocated between you and the other members of your team or your cybersecurity team, so that stuff's being looked at. Get yourself a good dashboard application that allows you to kind of analyze the system and look at, the high level stuff. Like you said, Dave, have discussions about the other stuff. And I'm big on this one. Have discussion with your insurance carriers, because when you explain to them what it is and what the challenge is, they might be able to give you an exclusion or something, so that if an event did occur, you would still have coverage. But I assure you, if you don't have a discussion with them and mention it, it will simply be denied on the back end.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Great point. And so the next piece here is principle of least privilege, John. And so principle of least privilege is, and our dear friend, Sammy Lihau, has made a living doing presentations. And so what is his presentations are basically on the reduction of admin rights everywhere. And so we fight this battle on almost a daily basis inside of organizations, John, where we get told by, let's say that it's a new application coming and the developer says, well, you just need to install that with admin rights, or the service account needs full admin rights on everything it touches. No, I argue that. No, it doesn't need full admin rights. We can actually look at that. And so, first of all, you can push back. Second of all, don't give admin rights to your users. That's number one. So you don't want to take and give admin rights to your users, because if that malware comes in, it's some type of, let's say it happens to come in through the email system, it sneaks through, and there's some type of a malicious payload, and it can happen. No email system is perfect. Or it can come in off of a USB. Maybe you don't block USBs in your organization, so now there's a payload on the USB. We can prevent a lot of that by creating whitelists with AppLocker as to what applications are actually allowed to run. And there's good ways and bad ways of doing this, but AppLocker is one that I really, really recommend for organizations to stop malware dead in its tracks. And so, you need to subscribe to kind of us in IT eating our own dog food here a little bit, where, we are taking and we are also, not using highly privileged workstations as our daily drivers. Your workstation as an IT pro should be an ultra low privilege workstation, and you should be jumping over to either jump boxes, or you should be going to a privileged access workstation. to be doing your daily driver work. You should be not typing in admin credentials, especially as IT pros. We need to secure our credentials just as much as, and if not more than what we need for our users. Because if some type of attack occurs with elevated rights, now all of a sudden the bad guy just skipped past the first 2 or 3 layers of security that you potentially have. So principle of zero trust and a principle of least privilege go hand in hand for me. The next one here, John, is multi-factor authentication and what I'll call the new norm of passwordless authentication. And so, Microsoft's got solutions like Hello for Business, where you can do facial recognition, you can do biometric, you can do PIN-based authentication, tag that on with multi-factor for everything. And I use the word MFA for everything because many of us just say, oh, well, I got MFA on my desktops or my servers, I'm good. Well, I actually argue that where, for example, if you've got a remote access solution where you're managing desktops or something like that, a lot of those solutions will have elevated rights to do their work on the desktops. You need to be taking in any of your SSO SaaS-based applications that can support MFA, enable that on those today as well. Yes, I understand it's a change for your businesses. Yes, I understand that not all users are going to want some type of an authenticator application on their phone because it's their personal device. Get fobs, get, YubiKeys, get, there's solutions around this. And I know, John, you've just come through a pretty large project right now. And, is it possible to multi-factor everything in 90 days? Is it possible?
It is. And Dave, we have a personal experience with this. We've done it for a large multinational deployment, actually. And so it's a pain. And actually, you may have to suspend all the other very important to the organization efforts you have to do it. So if you want to avoid that, take our advice and start implementing it now in areas where you don't have it. Because I can tell you this, out of the 10 largest insurance underwriters, insurance carriers globally, all 10 require MFA. So if you don't have MFA, they won't even talk to you about renewing your policy, and they won't cover anything if your current policy is called into play. Now, among them, there are variances in what they require MFA on. At a minimum, they all require MFA on anything that touches something in the cloud. So if you use Exchange Online, that account better have MFA. If you use a cloud-based ERP, better have MFA, okay? They all require MFA on anything that is remotely touching your network. So your VPN users better be using MFA, okay? And then, of course, they require MFA on anything with any elevated privileges, so administrative rights, the ability to install software or do those kind of things. And I do want everybody to think in this way. Don't think to yourself, well, I could make an argument to justify this because that isn't what this is about. You can make a very compelling argument. They don't want to pay. They're going to say, well, we appreciate what you're saying, but the terms of the agreement said MFA on everything. You don't have MFA on that account. Sorry. And a great example is if you're using accounts for, say, software notifications or alerts, those kind of things. I can't turn MFA on these because they don't support it. Example is current SQL database mail doesn't actually support triggering MFA. But if you talk to your insurance carrier, often you will find that when they're defining the requirements for MFA on all accounts, they're talking about all accounts that can log on interactively. So if you remove the log on locally right, the account works fine, and you don't need that right on an account used for email notification. So again, communicate, collaborate, discuss, and you will find good solutions. I'm sure of it. And Dave, we've had some questions and some comments come in, and Hugh asks, a great question. What are some of the vulnerability scanners you recommend for a Windows environment? And, Dave, as you mentioned, you and I spend a lot of our time in the Azure platform and the Windows ecosystem. And so the ATP, the Defender 365, the Defender ATP products, those are great tools, and you can get into them fairly inexpensively. And Dave, you can speak more about that. Or if you're a very large organization and you really want to take it deeper, you can get into even things like Microsoft Direct Threat Experts, where they have their threat vulnerability teams available to you and everything else. So those are great tools to check out, particularly if you're already using M365 in your environment, to add in some vulnerability scanners and assessment and dashboarding tools. Back to you, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so we had a few other comments coming in from Andy as well. And I like one in particular here, that his organization, they're treating MFA as crucial. And he says, don't listen to users that whine. It's just, it's just something that you just have to do it. And you have to, it's a little bit of pain at the beginning, but you just have to go through. And that's coming from somebody that's had to go through and actually implement it like us. And yes, you're going to have some of your users that are, reluctant to change. And, that's okay. We'll just have to hold their hand a bit and help them through it.
Great. And Dave, and I want to throw in here that, one of the things that I've done with users is that helps the process is one, let them express their concerns, because until they feel they've been heard, it's hard to get them to listen. And the other thing is let them know that we're not doing this to make their lives harder. We're not even doing it just for the insurance companies. We're doing it because it's very valuable to us as IT pros to help protect not only the organization's assets, but its users, its employees. Because in the event of ransomware, these employees could get temporarily laid off. Or maybe the ransomware affects the ability for the company to make their direct deposit. Imagine that. All of us kind of have auto pay configured for certain bills, maybe our mortgage or whatever. What would happen if you didn't get your direct deposit on time? A lot of those would probably bounce and things like that. So, us in IT, when we implement things like MFA, those are just actions we're taking to help try and prevent that from occurring. And sometimes when you express it to them in a way that shows personal value to them, they might listen. Now, there's always a person that is just not going to hear you, and it's as you mentioned, Dave, and as Andy mentioned, you just have to kind of hear them out and do your work and know that it's the right decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a couple more questions that came in here, just because these are so good and so relevant. Christopher was asking what the name of the tool was to detect vulnerabilities in Office 365, and it's basically the Defender suite of products. So it's called Microsoft 365 Defender now is the technical term for it. And so, yeah, if you just do some research on it, you'll be able to find it. Another one came in from Arun, which was always on VPN, Microsoft just promoting it. And is there MFA for such a tool? And yeah, absolutely. MFA for always on VPN can be integrated with Azure MFA. So yeah, absolutely. All right, we've got a bit more information. We'll come back to some questions here in a minute. Thank you guys very much for making this interactive. It makes it a lot of fun. So now, this is probably the single biggest one right now, and I'm actually in a couple active projects. As soon as I'm actually off this call, I'm going to get on with our longtime listener on our webinars, Edgar, and we're actually in the process of implementing secured guarded fabrics for his organization right now. And so one of the biggest things that you can do right now, today, if you have a single attack surface, if you've listened to everything that we've told you as Microsoft professionals over the years, where get down to a single domain. Multi-domains is no good. It's too hard to manage. Get all your infrastructure down to a single domain. So you've probably gone through all these migration projects where we've collapsed everything down to a single domain. Well, as it turns out, from a security perspective, that actually wasn't such a good idea, because now our most critical assets that drive our virtual infrastructure are now living in the same attack surface. So if domain admins gets compromised in your primary domain, now they have your hypervisors, now they have your backups, now they have everything. It is actually very simple to move yourself over to a fabric. You just spin up a couple of domain controllers, John. Then you apply all your security baselines, harden that, get it down to 0 CVEs inside of that infrastructure. Then Microsoft, in their hyperconverged infrastructure platform, actually supports moving a Hyper-V cluster from one domain over to another. There's a process you can follow for this. So you can actually move those hypervisors over from your existing domain over to an ultra-secure fabric. That ultra-secure fabric has a limited set of logons. That ultra-secure fabric is something that the insurance companies are really liking right now. Make sure that your backup targets are in there. And if you really want to take this to the next level, you can have multiple fabrics that you create, one for your hypervisors, maybe one for your backups. Separate sets of credentials. Make sure that it's got multi-factor enabled on all of it. This can potentially save your bacon if it's the type of malware attack that we're talking about that is irrecoverable. There is no choice to pay or do anything. So at least you have a chance to recover. The one thing that I will advise, though, is that before you start your recovery activities, you need to get the bad stuff out of your network, just like John said. It's like being in the video game and you're respawning over and over again. You're going to go through all the effort to recover, let all your users back in, just to have it all wiped out again. So you need to make sure that you get that out of there, all right? The next thing is for example, Microsoft Advanced Threat Protection Sensors. A lot of people think that, antivirus is enough. Antivirus is absolutely not enough anymore. But you also need advanced threat protection sensors, checking things like vulnerabilities on your iOS devices that you've got, so your network infrastructure. You want to make sure that you've got any of your network infrastructure, like Apple devices, iOSs, Android devices, desktops. Microsoft's actually just extended their ATP platform to Office 365 apps now. So if you have ATP, you might notice that there's a little bar on the top that says that your document has been protected by Microsoft Advanced Threat Protection. Click here to enable it. So it's going to actually go check to see if there's any nasty macros or anything in there that are going to run potentially infect you, because that's a big attack surface. Now, one of the ones that I missed in this list here, John, that I think is really important for you to talk about is Microsoft ATP sensors for identity. How does that work? Can you integrate these ATP sensors into like existing domain controllers so you can scout like critical group changes, so you can scout like password resets, usage of highly privileged accounts, things like that? Is that possible?
That is not only possible, Dave, that is one of the biggest tools that we can put into our toolkit for helping get in front of the current level of attacks that are coming at us and the ones that are potentially downstream, and minimize their impact when they do hit us, right? Because almost all attacks have some form of identity compromise, whether they're elevating an existing account because you're running as an admin or something like that, or whether a credential has been social engineered or whatever. But when you get down to it, identity is at the root of how these things are getting delivered and working. So you're absolutely right. We need to be watching that and taking a look at it. And, as part of, again, talking in a Windows environment, as part of that Microsoft 365 Defender solution, there is a Defender for Identity product in there that you can use. And you can use things like Microsoft Sentinel so that you can get, integrated SIEM in there, so security, incident, and event management reporting, because that's huge, because we're not talking about the old days of antivirus protection where we just update our signatures and we call it good. Right now, we're under constant threat, constant attack, so we have to be constantly watching, constantly looking. So that's where the buzzword single pane of glass comes in. But, for me, what that means is that you have a dashboard that presents you data that you can quickly look at, understand, and filter out the stuff that's important to you versus what's not important to you, and then dive deeper into those pieces of data that are super important for you. And so that's why, like everything you're talking about, where you have to have these sensors everywhere, that's why they're so valuable, right? Because they're constantly feeding back data. And then a lot of the modern systems can take that. They can filter a lot of it out for you to reduce the noise that's in the system. So I call it like, the old days when you watch TV and you had that white snow, we'd call it, or the mess on the TV where you couldn't really see the picture. Yeah, I'm that old. But anyways, we want to reduce that so that when we're looking at our dashboard or we're looking at a report or we're looking at whatever it is we're looking at, that we can quickly get to what we need to get to and make a decision and take an action, because ultimately that's what will protect us at the end of the day. And, I can't emphasize enough, you can't emphasize enough that the modern attitude to have when it comes to threat protection is to get engaged, stay informed, communicate, collaborate with your team members, and, make a decision and act early, because the longer you wait, the longer it takes, the more of your environment is compromised, the more they get a handle on, the harder it will be for you to recover, possibly the harder it will be for your organization to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually just had a really great question that came in from Kevin here. And so this question from Kevin is a separate AD fabric for us for backups and hypervisors better than just not having hypervisors and backups in Active Directory? I'm thinking of environments not using Hyper-V or Veeam, for example, organizations that use ESXi and Unitrends and not allowing AD credentials on ESXi or Unitrends. So believe it or not, Kevin, you are already running a fabric. A separate logon realm that you have is exactly what we are taking and we are getting at with this. And so that is so key for taking and doing that. So even if it's in a workgroup configuration, separate sets of credentials, a little harder to manage, but totally doable. Just don't have the master sets of keys inside of your primary Active Directory. So such a good point. Thank you very much on that. And so, John, we've got a couple more that we're going to take and be able to go through here. So much great content on this. The next one is for, the post-breach now. An incident has been detected. All of the alarms are going off. Think of you having a big red light going off on your desk, almost like you're scoring a goal in a professional hockey game. And something is going on. Your alert systems are lighting up like a Christmas tree. What can you do to immediately contain that threat? And the answer for you is inside of your solution. It probably comes with some type of a software-based network isolation module inside of it. So our general rule of thumb is if it's anything more than an informational alert, if it's a medium alert, high or critical, we are going to immediately isolate that device and prevent it from communicating and causing further damage while we do investigation. We get some threat intelligence packages running against that machine to collect diagnostics to see what it has actually done, to see how much damage has been done to it. And typically the software-based network isolation will kick in a matter of seconds once you hit the isolate button inside of your solution. And it will only be allowed at that point in time to talk to the said threat protection server. So you can still typically have a backdoor console to run some limited subsets of commands, but that is really key, is that not leaving those things on your network, because one of the problems with an autonomous system that's going to automatically start isolating things is inadvertently you could be creating a DOS or denial of service type of attack situation, where when you take and when you set this up, just imagine throwing out false positives out on the network and having things just start automatically isolating. That would not be a good idea, would it, John? So unfortunately, this part of it is more of a manual approach, but still very, very important from a network-based software isolation. The next one here, John, this one's all you, the black box. If all else fails, what do you go back to? What are your options that you have? So let's say they've got your fabric now somehow, and you ask yourself, well, how could they get this fabric? This fabric is supposed to be ultra secure, and you told me multi-factor and all of this. Okay, let me just throw a scenario by you. you have a key administrator on your network. This key administrator is running into financial difficulties right now. This key administrator has just gotten a foreclosure letter from the bank that they're going to come have their house taken away for whatever reasons. All of a sudden, there's a contact that's made out to somewhere on the dark web, and did you know that you can sell credentials on the dark web? And so now all of your defenses are gone because that MFA is on that administrator's device. And if they sell those credentials, you think how horrible this could be. What are your options at this point in time? Because now as the threat actor, John, I have bought and purchased the highest level of credentials inside of your infrastructure. What can you do as an organization to defend against this?
Yeah, so this is huge, everyone, and I do want to stop and take a minute to let everybody know that organizations always have to make a decision on the risk to accept and the risk they can't, because we could think of scenario after scenario after scenario, and it's just impossible to protect against all of them. And in fact, it becomes a rabbit hole that we get down that we can't get out of. So, it's our job in IT to, think of all the possibilities and then identify, like you mentioned earlier, Dave, the low-hanging fruit, the things we can protect against with the least amount of effort, the least amount of expense, and then work our way down, right? And when we get to the really complicated, really expensive ones, that's when we engage the business and we let them make the decision. We're going to talk about out-of-date equipment here in a minute, but when it comes to making sure that you have that option to recover against those things that you chose that, hey, we're going to accept the risk, they're too expensive for us to do whatever, and then one of them happens and you need to recover, your only option at that point is typically something that's immutable, unchangeable. So that's a backup that you took and you moved offline. And, Dave, we've used all different methods, everything from USB drives that kind of go in a safety deposit box like old days with tapes, to, a strategy that I'm a big fan of, which is where we actually configure a backup target that sits on the other side of a network port, and then we design that system such that that network port is only turned on and active for the amount of time necessary for the backup job to run, pump across that network connection, then the network connection shuts off, and in most cases, we actually power down the device. We can power it back up through its IPMI, which is also connected to a disabled port. But that gives us options for creating an offline backup that can't be affected by normal malware or attacks, but yet is still available to us without the heavy extra load of management of plugging in that USB drive or whatever. So there's options for these things. The important thing is you get them. You get yourself a backup that either by the way it's designed or by the controls you're putting around it is immutable, unchangeable. Nothing can impact its integrity.
Yeah, absolutely, John. So here's some of our final tips that we have for everyone here today before we wrap up. So this is all about tips and tricks on ransomware backup and recovery. If you don't have some type of advanced persistent threat protection, go get yourself some licenses today. Most vendors will give you a 30, 60, 90-day trial of this. You need to get this onto your devices. I had a conversation with the customer last week where they were humming and hawing about taking and putting it on all the desktops, and there was going to be quite some cost. And I said, listen, we can only protect what we can see, and if we can't see it, we can't protect against it. You could have open exploits that are out there on some of those devices today. Put it on as many things as you possibly can so we can get maximum visibility inside of our own infrastructure. The second piece is turn on all of the cloud protection that you possibly can. And what do I mean by that? Typically in your cloud platforms that you have in Azure, AWS, Google, the big cloud players that are out there, these things are already inside of your tenant. You just have to go and turn it on and enable it. Yes, I know there's a cost to doing that, but if it's there and it's available for you and there's no infrastructure pieces to this, make sure that you take and that you go through and you're enabling and giving yourself the best chances possible. The next piece is train your team. Train them immediately on this new landscape that we have. There are specific training courses actually out there for a cybersecurity operational analyst now, a training course, platform, certification that Microsoft actually has right now. Get your teams trained on this. Make sure that, that's not the reason that you're potentially having a breach. If you have to, get help from outside consultants. And what I mean on this, and this kind of goes with invest on a cyber ops team, is that if you don't have the expertise in-house, you're not just going to snap your fingers and it's not just going to be readily available, because here's the crux right now. Everybody wants an expert cybersecurity team on staff or on call. That's what everyone wants. There's physically not enough consultants or teammates out there to do this. So what John and I are recommending now is that if your vendors provide platforms and programs for this, seriously look into this, because, for example, we're big fans of the Microsoft Threat Experts. Yes, John, there's a cost to this. Of course there is. But when we can take an on-demand, say, hey, Microsoft, we noticed that this weird threat came through. Can you please help us dig in with, advanced threat hunting and make sure that it didn't spread across my entire infrastructure? And they're there for you right now to take and help you with those types of requests. Well, those types of skills not just going to magically come into your teams. The last ones are take all your threats seriously and make sure that all your cyber policies are up to date. And with that, John, we took an awful lot of questions. This was an amazing session. As always, thanks to all of our sponsors that make these events possible. Gladys, thank you very much for allowing us to do this webinar with you. And on behalf of myself and John, thank you guys very much. And we'll hand it back over to Gladys, as I know that there's an exciting next session that's waiting up in the queue.
Thank you so much, Dave and John. Excellent presentation, a lot of great insights, and coming at a really crucial time for a lot of our attendees too. So thanks so much.